This sort of is a very unique moment for both Prime Minister Netanyahu as well as all three of these leaders. President Biden being the only one of whom who knows the official end date to his tenure. And so President Biden will be leaving office on January 20th, and he has said one of his main objectives between now and then is to get a ceasefire deal across the table. We've also heard Vice President Harris be one of the first people in the administration to forcefully call for one months ago. So she would likely be on board for that.
Welcome to Reporter's Notebook, where we talk to the Washington Examiner's top journalists about the stories breaking on their beats. I'm Jim Antle, and I'm joined today by defense reporter Mike Brest. Mike, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu addressed Congress talking about the conflict in Gaza. What were some of the key takeaways?
So some of the big takeaways from Prime Minister Netanyahu's address was, number one, he tried to posit Israel as sort of the tip of the spear for the U.S. in a way similar to a message President Zelensky of Ukraine has used pretty frequently, which is they're fighting a war so the U.S. doesn't have to. The U.S. doesn't have to have boots on the ground. They don't have to be involved in any conflict. And yet, if you give us the weapons, we will fight the bad guys for you. And so that was a heavy theme during his speech, going as far to say the U.S. should fast track even more weapons to Israel. And so while he was largely grateful towards President Biden, and he even expressed gratitude towards former President Trump for what he did during his administration, he still sort of went out of his way to ask for more from the current administration. That being said, he angered a number of lawmakers when he, especially Democratic lawmakers, when he referred to protesters of the war as Iran's simple stooges, for lack of a better term. And so that angered even the White House, who pushed back on that assertion today, saying there are very reasonable concerns with how this war is played out.
So Netanyahu is kind of in an interesting dynamic because President Biden has now dropped out of the race for re-election. He's being replaced on the Democratic ticket by Vice President Harris, whose views on Israel are not radically different from Biden's, but they're marginally different in the direction that Netanyahu likely is not going to like. And then, of course, he has former President Trump, who may return to the White House, and he has to kind of now navigate relationships with all three of these people.
That's exactly right. This sort of is a very unique moment for both Prime Minister Netanyahu as well as all three of these leaders. President Biden being the only one of whom who knows the official end date to his tenure. And so President Biden will be leaving office on January 20th, and he has said one of his main objectives between now and then is to get a ceasefire deal across the table. We've also heard Vice President Harris be one of the first people in the administration to forcefully call for one months ago. So she would likely be on board for that. We also heard from members of the relatives of the hostages who are currently held by Hamas throughout this week and leading up to and after Prime Minister Netanyahu's speech, expressing a level of frustration with him at the fact that a deal to secure the release of their loved one hasn't been agreed to yet. And so there are questions of whether or not, from their perspective, whether or not the Prime Minister is slow walking a potential deal. And we heard from the U.S. or from the White House today talk about President Biden's meeting with Prime Minister Netanyahu and his upcoming meeting with the Vice President that's set to happen later today.
What did Netanyahu have to say in his address about what Gaza would look like once Israel has completed its military mission?
So there were no big surprises and there were no significant, overwhelming plans that were announced, but something that he said now for a little while is that he believes Israel needs to have some level of a security presence there to ensure that Hamas doesn't reconstitute, but that there should be a civilian administration set up so that
of Palestinians,
so that non-Hamas Palestinians can govern themselves, essentially providing them with a new government outside of Hamas, which has been in charge for the last 15 years or so.
So one pitch that Netanyahu tried to make to lawmakers was that the enemies of Israel are essentially identical to the enemies of America. Was that a convincing?
That was a convincing argument for the Netanyahu supporters in Congress, primarily Republicans. And so what Netanyahu argued was that, as I mentioned, they are on the front lines fighting against Hamas, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, and more broadly, their financial backer, Iran.
Right.
And so a big part of Netanyahu's sort of pitch to Congress was that we're fighting Iran for you so you don't have to. Now we know that both President Biden and former President Trump's administration sought to turn away from the Middle East. Both administrations view China as the dominant threat moving forward into the future. So both of them have wanted to turn away from the Middle East and put more resources to the Indo-Pacific region. The question is, does this war spark a more widespread regional conflict that drags the U.S. in, or can, as both administrations or both candidates would like, bring the war to a close?
Thank you, Mike. You can read Mike and the rest of our national security team's coverage at washingtonexaminer.com.